Hi, and welcome to today's topic, which is the power of shame. Now, before I jump into this topic, let's start by defining shame and guilt. Just to kind of more or less have like a clear starting point from here on. Now, the feeling of shame and guilt can surface when you feel regret over an action that you felt was wrong or inappropriate. Or you could have been on the receiving end of someone else's behavior that made you feel shame and guilt. And these feelings are normally combined with a very strong influence of feeling humiliated and also stress because it caused a negative reaction on your character and how you perceive yourself as being seen and judged by other people. Now, shame is a strong emotion that I can confidently perhaps say that I'm sure that you've experienced in your life. And let's also be honest, no one is above experiencing the deep and intense feelings of shame. And it's also how we react to it that greatly defines or builds also our character. And shame can also be deeply buried in the psyche that you have now unconsciously adapted to it and perhaps don't even realize the full extent and the ripple effects of it. The expression of shame can have a tremendous impact on your personality. Now, the signs can also, for example, be anything from always perhaps making excuses for your existence, always apologizing when you've made a mistake. Even the smallest little mistake that doesn't even require an apology, you will throw in an apology. Always, for example, putting other people's needs ahead of your own. And you perhaps could also always be trying to fix yourself. And you are always adapting to other people, regardless of the discomfort that it is causing you. And you might also find that you have much more prone, right? You're much more prone to feeling attacked and even allowing it to happen, as the deep hidden shame is causing you to feel so shameful, and it means too shameful to stand up for yourself and to assert healthy boundaries. And now you can probably see where I'm going with this, because boundaries is a very important factor. If you struggle with poor boundaries, then shame will most likely be one of your most dominant, emotional, debilitating, hidden emotions. And this now rolls over into your need for acceptance. And this need for acceptance is now just being met by more shame, by dynamics that's going to make you feel shameful. And when I say that, I mean also in the sense of acceptance. I mean that longing for it. That longing for that acceptance is what makes you feel more shameful. As you feel that there is something wrong with you for wanting acceptance in such a strong way. Now, because of this, you lower your bar of what is acceptable behavior towards you and what is not. And all for the sake of acceptance. And then also, of course, to ease the feelings of shame, which causes you now to feel inadequate and to also now avoid people because of it, avoiding circumstances. And then, of course, cutting off dynamics and connections to people where you are being accepted. Because the more you rely on acceptance from outside of you, the more you will be vulnerable to abuse and also being taken advantage of. Remember that you are designed to adapt. And sometimes you can also adapt so much that an unhealthy emotion becomes a normal feeling. And it becomes part of your lifestyle until one day you just realize how uncomfortable you have been feeling all along in your life. Because your psychological and your emotional threshold to suppress the shame has now reached its limit. And the dam wall has now fallen apart. And in the past, perhaps you could have felt just discomfort of the shame. However, you also couldn't really put your finger on it. And that is because of the expression of that. You feel it formed a normal part of your life. It's now formed part of your foundation. But now the suppression rolls over into gazillion of symptoms. Now, one of the most dominant symptoms of shame is feeling unworthy, lack of self-worth. And then also, in this case, as I said, it's a secondary symptom, meaning it's the ripple effect of feeling that deep shame and guilt. For example, something happened that made you feel shame and guilt. And then as a result of perhaps not knowing how to process and deal with these strong emotions, you start to feel inadequate within yourself, and a low self-esteem becomes stronger and stronger. So you might hear yourself saying a lot that you feel unworthy of this or you feel unworthy of that. But have you ever actually stopped and asked yourself, what did you feel before you felt unworthy or undeserving? You are so accustomed to dealing with symptoms that maybe you've never really stopped and paused and asked what happened. What emotion did I feel before I felt the strong emotion in the present moment? Remember that everything has a starting point, and that includes shame and guilt, and also feeling unworthy. Now, it's also a debilitating feeling to experience, as it can also be one of the root causes of why you feel so much disconnection amongst each other, especially amongst loved ones. Right? You feel shame when you connect to someone else, as your need for connection could also have been rejected, it could have been abused, and it could have been dismissed in the past, causing you to feel wrong for wanting a connection in the first place. So now you avoid the very thing that you need. You are now we are programmed to be connected. It's in our biological makeup. Now our need also for connection has now become a battleground. Shame can even be behind violence, but in this case, instead of shame being associated with a hiding instinct such as retreating or being a peacekeeper, it's now associated with a fighting instinctive response. And that's taking action, becoming the aggressor, and behaving defensively. Now, when you felt shame, question here, when you felt shame, which coping mechanism or instinctive response served you the best in the past? Even though that reaction, it didn't actually help you. It didn't necessarily help you to cope with the situation. However, it was the most dominant reaction that was triggered at the time of perhaps feeling rejected, or whatever the circumstances were that made you feel the shame. Because what happened in that moment is that unconsciously you start to associate shame with the reaction that you felt served you. Even though, like I said, it didn't necessarily serve you, but there was a reaction. And that is what we associated with. That is the connection that we then make. And so what happens now is that in the future situations, these coping mechanisms will always be triggered. So for example, are you a hider or are you a fighter? In some cases, perhaps it could not even be any of them. It could also be that you freeze. So that means, say for example, when you are in a situation and someone makes you feel shameful, does the fighting instinctive response come up? Meaning, do you become defensive? Do you start to argue? Do you start to feel irritated? Do you start to feel aggressive? Now, for example, if it's the hiding instinct, then you might find that you're the kind of person that starts to retreat a little bit. You might feel that you're the peacekeeper. You try to smooth things over. You try to adapt to the situation to avoid feeling more shame. Now, we also have people that are, for example, classified as introverts. They're, for example, the ones that the hiding instinct would also now be most dominant, right? So they keep themselves small because of deep subconscious shame that they might be feeling. And then you also have extroverts who also, in some cases, not all, actually also are now hiding their shame behind a really big personality. Now, I also have another video coming up about extroverts and introverts. And this is just a very super short perspective that I'm sharing here right now. So shame is also, for example, behind narcissism, right? Just as a brief short example, deep suppressed shame is often covered by an overinflated ego. Now, the ego coping mechanism for shame can also now be repeated to the point where you have convinced yourself that you are free from the shame, because the dominant feeling of shame has now been temporarily programmed or overly programmed with this new ego and also this coping mechanism until the deep shame is triggered again in the future and the ego side comes forward even stronger. Hence, instead of just feeling defensive, a person can actually become an abuser, because an aggressor, for example, is now experiencing the feelings of shame, and his or her reaction to the situation is now shameful. And then that triggers a volatile reaction with the unconscious intention to regain and to tap back into the ego in order to feel superior over everyone else. Now, we actually see this almost in every politics situation, right? Fighting for their beliefs, fighting for values, fighting for dominance, fighting for respect, and also fighting to control everything. And this boils down to needing security. It boils down to needing safety. And it boils down to avoiding shame, losing face in the face of the public. Now, which could also translate, for example, as a fear of humiliation. But then again, you have to look at why is the fear of humiliation there? Because that again is just a secondary symptom, it's a secondary response. Now, in the English language, there seems to be just one meaning for shame, and it's a very negative interpretation. But in some languages, the word shame can actually have three meanings, and therefore serve three types of purposes. Now, where one spectrum to this meaning, for example, which I would call the predicted shame, which means that you experience the feeling of shame of an intended action before the action is taken. So the more empathetic you are, you will notice that you automatically try to imagine how someone would feel before you do or say something, right? So feeling the feeling of shame before saying something or taking action. It's almost like kind of like the idea where you put yourself in someone else's shoes before you do or say something. Right? Sometimes you might also have a really good feeling about what your next word or action is going to be, and then you take action. But now, in some cases, when you reverse the roles and you put yourself in the on the receiving end of the other person, for example, with what it is that you want to say, and your actions and your words perhaps has a negative reaction in you, now that would, for example, cause you to think twice before saying or doing something. So in this case, shame can also serve as a healthy discernment alarm regarding a planned action or words that you want to say or convey to someone. Now, this is what I call, like I said, predicted shame. Now, I also know that we can't always assume that everyone, for example, that we interact with will feel the same way that we do. So this can also be a bit of a hit and miss prediction. However, I'm sure that in most cases, more so rather than less, you've probably realized that your initial prediction was right on. So now, secondly, we also have personal shame. And this feeling of shame is due to hurtful actions taken against you or feeling insulted in one way or another. And your values and your beliefs and your character or your physical body was disrespected. It was questioned, it was attacked or criticized by someone, for example, that you perceived as being an authority figure. And the power that you gave this person, meaning the power that you gave them over your quality of life, is the reason behind your shameful reaction. You believed that the reaction and the words of someone else while you were perhaps still trying to find your own truth. And it is always in these moments when we lose our power. Now, also over to another more positive side to shame. Thirdly, we have the ego shame. And this shame keeps your ego in check. Now, which is not always a bad thing necessarily. I'm sure perhaps, do you ever remember hurting someone or saying something hurtful to a person and you felt remorse and guilt afterwards as you realized the impact of your reaction or your action? Now that feeling is also called shame, and it's the ego shame that is now surfaced to show you. It's showing you the way how to behave, and the way that you did behave was not in alignment with your true authentic values and yourself, and it was also not in alignment with the person on the receiving end. Now, shame can also show you where your limitations are in a healthy way. It can show you when you've also now perhaps overstepped someone else's boundaries. And it can show you also perhaps where you unintentionally hurt someone. And it can show you when your ego has now grown or perhaps also out of control. Now, shame is not just a negative experience with the negative disabling consequences. It can actually also keep you in check and guide you to be more in harmony with your environment, with your relationships, and ultimately with your relationship with yourself. Now, shame is a very, very strong inherited emotional state as well, as you are not the first person in your DNA lineage to feel and experience this feeling. This is also felt as an already existed predisposition in your DNA lineage, and circumstances and dynamics in your life brought life to this dormant emotion. Now, shame can actually also keep us very grounded, as it can positively influence us to become aware also of our limitations, also of our boundary limits, especially on our energy and what we are capable of doing with the physical and the emotional resources that we have access to. Now, in order to have a more balanced life, for example, if you see now ego shame coming forward, you could also recognize it in the form of coming to terms that you might need more support, or for example, help with something that you're doing. But however, the actions that you're taking, the resources that you need, is now causing you to perhaps step outside of your comfort zone. If you're stepping outside into an area or category where you might not necessarily have mastered something, however, someone else has. And you can resolve the problem by just asking for support. And sometimes when we start to realize and we feel these limitations to our character or limitations to what we're trying to do, and when we especially reach a goal, this ego shame can also actually show you that you need support. And now it's how you interpret that shame that's either going to make or break the reaction that you have to that. Because ultimately, for me personally, I see this as a very positive reaction because it's showing you where you need support in order for you to achieve your goal. So it's very important to not interpret perhaps an ego limitation that you feel that you've hit, that, oh, I can't do this, or I'm not worthy of something. And this is an important moment for you to really truly recognize it in order to expand and to grow further in your journey. Because, for example, now what you just need to do, you just need to expand your resources. And that always doesn't necessarily have to mean that it has to be within. It can be from people in your environment. And now also another small hurdle is that we're actually biologically designed to be negative. So it's normal to interpret this feeling as negative, especially when you feel in the context of your ego shame. Now, positive shame also helps you to make better judgment, especially in terms of your energy and also where that energy is needed and where it is not needed. Now, I would also highly recommend that you go through my online healing shame course that is in our premium membership site, because this course is there along with many other more powerful healing courses and such great content. So now I have a question for you. What is your reaction to the feeling of shame? Because your reaction to it sets your dominant characteristics in place. And when you feel shame, do you run? Do you hide? Do you freeze? Do you fight? Or do you perhaps become overly confident to hide it? Or perhaps even aggressive with the intention to deflect from the feeling and to divert from the people that's causing you to feel this. Now, I'm sure that you might also recognize yourself here. This awareness already places a lot of power in your hands. As you know, one thing that you have control over are your reactions. So next time when you feel your most dominant character coming out, especially when that shame is being triggered, acknowledge in that moment how this reaction kept your old identity safe, and it no longer serves the new identity that you are transforming into. Because whether you realize it or not, every minute, every day you are healing and changing, your identity is forever changing. Hence why I refer to old identity. And so when you feel that feeling of shame, also just actually allow it to flow through you. Just let it drain out of you, because your resistance to feel that feeling of shame, it actually intensifies it. Resistance locks in the feeling of shame. Resistance is very much connected to your freeze reaction as well, which locks in the feeling of shame and then also the psychological stress that it's causing. And now the shame can then, as a result, psychosomatically also flow to the weakest point in your body and flare up as pain, especially if you are trying to suppress deep anger that was triggered with the shame. Now, shame can also be the hidden block behind so many challenges that we are facing, and it can even be behind abundance blocks. How are you going to attract money if you feel shameful and unworthy of having it? So you see, shame can be very powerful, and it can also serve as an ego check for us. And it can also serve you to be more mindful of what you do and say before you actually take that action. And then it can also cause you to question yourself and to lose trust in yourself, and then ultimately lose trust in your relationships with others. So I invite you to practice mindfulness during times when you react to shame and to call your power back from the moment, because through awareness, you can instantly transform your reaction and then also ultimately your experience. So remember to check out my premium site, and until next time, be the light that you are. Hi guys, thank you for joining me, and remember to grab your copy of Metaphysical Anatomy Volume 1 on Amazon, 679 medical ailments. And here I also talk about the psychosomatic root causes of these ailments, and I'm spoiling you because I'm even adding key points for you to start asking important questions to start improving your quality of life and call your power back from your mind, your body, and your past as well. And also remember to follow me on Instagram, Yvette Rose with the digit 1, and also on Facebook in Metaphysical Anatomy. Until next time, bye guys.